We're going to be in Luke chapter 2 this morning. So you can turn there and we will read through the passage shortly. Tim prayed for some of the families, all of the families who have been touched by death in the last week. It's been a heavy week. So we had 4 people either part of the body or connected to the body pass away in about span of 5 days. And I think that certainly for those of us interacting with and meeting with the families, it was a heavy time. But I know also for those of you who kept seeing on the prayer chain, another one. I know that you felt some of the weight of that, and last week I shared that one of the scriptures that was just sort of rolling through my head was the 4th verse of the 23rd Psalm that promises that the Lord is with us as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and there's this promise implicit in that Jesus sees us across the threshold of eternity, that even in that darkest pit, the darkest that we can imagine, he is there with us. But I feel like it's important to reflect on another piece of wisdom literature that reminds us that it's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. And we are that right now. In the last week or so, there is mourning that is taking place. And the reason that we are told that it's better to be in that house than in the house of feasting is because that's the end of all mankind. All of us have a problem with mortality. We are all going to end up out there, or some other cemetery, because this one's apparently full. We're all going to end up in that spot. And it's good for us to contemplate our own mortality and where we stand with respect to this. Because if we die in our sins, not knowing the Lord, not receiving his forgiveness, not by faith trusting in his work on the cross to forgive sins, then our mortality will lead us to everlasting judgment. But if we are in Christ, forgiven, then we are expectant of eternal joy in the presence of our Creator. And I think that it's important for us to not, because some of us have contemplated our mortality and where we stand with respect to the Creator of the universe. I think it's also important for us to contemplate the mortality of those around us, of our children, of our neighbors, of our friends, of our coworkers. A week like this should inspire in us a sense of urgency. I spoke with Bob Roth for about 5 minutes Christmas Eve. Christmas night, I stared at his lifeless body. And none of us are promised tomorrow. So it's something worth considering, and that's why it's better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. So on that note, let's take a look at Luke chapter 2. We're going to be in verse 39 to the end of the chapter. Let me read it. Luke writes, "And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why? Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know I must be in my father's house?" And they didn't understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. The word of the Lord. When I say Five Guys, what do you think of? Burgers and fries. Someone gets a gold star over here. Burgers and fries, right? Five Guys, huh? When I say Ruth's Chris, what do you think of? Steak. Ugh. Right? Red meat. I'm from south of the Mason-Dixon line, and that is the only food group down there. So if I were to say to you, I have a real hankering for some peanuts, let's go to Five Guys. That would be weird, right? I mean, they do have peanuts at Five Guys. My children actually fell up on those. I don't know why we buy them burgers or hot dogs when we go, because they could just eat the peanuts and be happy. But they have peanuts at Five Guys. I would never go to Five Guys for peanuts. What if I were to say, I have a real hankering for some creamed spinach? Let's go to Ruth's Chris. That'd be silly, right? I mean, they have creamed spinach at Ruth's Chris. I've had it. It's actually not bad. But that's not why you go to Ruth's Chris. Right? I would have a problem with focus or recognizing what the purpose is of Ruth's Chris or Five Guys. If I say to you Olive Garden, what do you think of? Someone say breadsticks? Yeah, breadsticks. Yeah, breadsticks. That's also weird. There's something wrong with that. You shouldn't think of breadsticks, but for some reason, that's the legacy they've carved out. If I say Red Lobster, what do you think of? I can't hear you. There you go. Yeah, if you said lobster, you were incorrect. Yeah, the correct answer was over here from the gentleman in the mask. Cheddar biscuits. Cheddar biscuits. Also, that's weird. I have said for a long time that those two restaurants clearly are focused on the wrong thing. They're paying attention to the free thing that everybody gets, not to the thing that they actually serve that brings in income. They're not paying attention to the entrees, they're paying attention to the bread. And that doesn't make a lot of sense from a business standpoint or from a restaurant standpoint. When you read Luke chapter 2, and in particular this last section, if you were reading it and you are thinking that the entire point of this passage is to describe an ancient Amber Alert, I don't think we're looking at it the way that Luke intended it. I think we're seeing the breadsticks and the cheddar biscuits and the creamed spinach and the peanuts. But there is real meat here that I think Luke wants us to see, to not get distracted by certainly we all feel the emotion. Any of us who have children and who have had the experience of one parent saying, well, I thought he was with you, and then the other one, I thought he was with you, and then realizing, well, we don't know where he is at all. And then to contemplate that, wow, this child was lost in a major metropolis at a time when there were no Amber Alerts or milk cartons. There wasn't even, all you could do was just give someone a description and they could draw it on a clay tablet, and that was the only thing you could do. How would they ever get him back? Joseph from Genesis. He's in Egypt. In the blink of an eye, he's gone. Mary and Joseph lost the Messiah. There is certainly this component of the passage here that tugs at our hearts, and we can certainly empathize with the parents here. But I don't think Luke's intention here was to tell us how to be good parents. It certainly wasn't, because, well, I don't think his message was, hey, lose your kids and it's all right, it'll work out. I also don't think that Luke's intention is to tell us how to raise our children, although there are certainly things that you can glean here about stature and wisdom and favor and faithfulness in terms of going to the temple regularly. I think Luke has another intention. And I think in order to get to that, just like with all narrative, particularly in the scriptures, where you have these small vignettes of things that are happening, especially in the Gospels, it's important for us to ask the question, why does this event follow that one? And why does it precede the next one? Because we're told by Luke that his entire intention in writing this to those who love God is to compile an ordered account of the events that took place. So we know that Luke is being very strategic in the way that he's writing this. And what's really peculiar is that we get this section here of Jesus' preteen life that doesn't exist anywhere else in the Gospels. None of the other Gospels recount anything after Jesus' infancy, give or take a number of months, up until we see him in his adult life, earthly ministry period when he's in his early 30s. And yet, Luke takes the time to pull out this one story, this one account of Jesus as a preteen. I love that Luke, both here and about 20 verses back, reminds us or tells us that his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. It's a clue that he gives to us, right? Because we know that Luke interviewed eyewitnesses. So we likely have a story that Mary reflects to Luke about her son. Only when she's reflecting it to Luke, she's had time to process it and think through it and realize, yeah, my son was right. I was all worried about the Amber Alert, lost the Messiah, totally failed the God of the universe sort of thing. And Jesus says, why? You're looking at the wrong thing. So what is it that Luke wants us to look at in this passage? Well, again, we see Jesus in his infancy in the previous passage where his parents bring him into the temple. And he is circumcised on the 8th day, and Mary goes through her purification rituals, and there's some offerings that are made, and they have a lovely time. And then they go back home, we're told, to Nazareth. Nazareth, that wonderful little town 65 miles north of Jerusalem that everyone wished they could forget. Remember his disciples? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? So he goes back to his hick town. It's all right, I'm from a hick town, grew up in Oklahoma. He's from his hick town north of Jerusalem, and there is no mention made of him, no thought of him, beyond this point at which Simeon describes this miraculous birth and the things that God will do through this child to bring about the salvation of Israel. And then if you look forward, we see in chapter 3 that we begin the account of John the Baptist, who is preparing the way of the Lord and baptizing Jesus and so on and so forth, and Jesus goes into his earthly ministry. And so there's this jump of 30 plus years were it not for this account that Luke gives to us. And I think there are two things, probably more, but there are at least two things that Luke is trying to communicate to us in this section of his gospel, as he shows us a window into what life was like with Jesus as this preteen. And remember, Luke is writing in order to give an ordered account. The reason it was necessary to give an ordered account and to have these things out there is that word of mouth can quickly turn into legend. You can get stories that, well, that's not exactly the way it happened, and that sounds actually a little bit more fantastic than it really was. And so it was necessary for the gospel writers to craft an ordered account that says this is how it happened. Another reason that the Gospels weren't necessary, apart from the fact that we find them instructive and they change our hearts, is that there is an enemy of the Gospel. And the enemy of the Gospel certainly attacked the early church with respect to persecution, physical harm, loss of property, those sorts of things. But the enemy of the Gospel also attacked the church via heresy. The enemy wants us to believe things that are not true about Jesus. And if he can cause that to happen, then he can supplant the entire redemption plan, in theory. God will do what he wants to do. So, what is it that Luke is writing in particular? Why do we see this several decades after Jesus has died and resurrected and ascended? Why do we see Luke feel the need to give us this section right here? Well, I would say it's for two purposes. We'll get to the second one in a little bit, but the first one, Luke intends to make it known that humanity and divinity were part of Jesus from the very beginning. Why is that important? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit too. There were two primary heresies, and there continue to be two primary heresies with respect to the person and nature of Jesus. One argues that there is no divinity there, or very little divinity, or just a tiny bit. And the other one attacks his humanity. So I want to talk about the first one, the humanity first. There's a heresy referred to as Docetism. It comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means to seem. And the idea behind it, what people communicated was that Jesus didn't really have a body. It seemed like he did, but he didn't really. And to be fair, the people that communicated those things had a really hard time grasping and putting together in their brains that humanity and divinity could come together in one person. How do you have that? And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go on. But there was a question of, is Jesus really human? And Luke says, yeah, he is. He tells us all about his birth in the beginning of chapter 2, and then he says, and just in case you thought that this was just for show, that it only seemed like he was born, no. There's an account here of Jesus having a normal human experience. He had parents. They went to church. He went with them. Get used to it, kids. What else do we see here? Verse 40, and the child grew. He had bones, and they expanded. I don't know what they used for growing pains back in the first century, but he had them. And he became strong, and he was filled with wisdom. So he actually increased in these things. And then Luke actually goes, I think, to extended lengths to remind us that he was a child in verse 40. And then in verse 42, he was 12 years old. Think about that. Think about what it was like to be 12, and then think, Jesus was 12 at some point. What must that have been like to be 12 and have brothers and sisters and be perfect? It couldn't have been easy. But he was 12. And then if you go on, it says in verse 43, the boy Jesus. Luke is reminding us that he's a real boy. There's humanity here. You ask, well, why is that important? I'll get there, I promise. And then we see, again, there's relationship with his parents. And there's some of this back and forth that we all experience with our parents. If they thought we should do this and we think that we should do that, and how does that all come together? And we're reminded in verse 51 that he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. That's remarkable. Remember, because Luke's point is also that he's divine. If you've ever wondered, is there some concrete thing that I can look at that explains, that shows me Philippians 2, that he existed as God but didn't regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but humbled himself and became obedient? Here it is. It's in verse 51 here. He was submissive to them. Jesus was a real boy with real bones and skin and a beating heart. And he had thoughts, internal thoughts. He had a soul, just like you and I have. He grew in wisdom. He progressed, both physically and emotionally and mentally. Jesus was a real boy. I know I'm starting to sound like I'm telling the story of Pinocchio, but this is actually, you may be thinking, why is he going into all this stuff? Well, because Luke does. And there's a reason that Luke does. It's important. Luke also reminds us that Jesus isn't just human, but he's divine. One of the primary heresies at the time that still exists today is referred to as adoptionism. And essentially, it argues that there really wasn't a divine part of Jesus, or if there was, it wasn't full divinity. That essentially, whether it be at Jesus' baptism, when the heavens part and the Spirit descends like a dove and the Father declares, "This is my beloved Son, the one I'm pleased with," that at that point, God says, "He's earned my favor. This is the one I'm going with." Or maybe it happened at the point of the crucifixion. Now he's definitely the one we're going with. Or at the point of the resurrection. And there's this attempt to divorce Jesus from either his humanity or his divinity. Adoptionism, it's to divorce him from his divinity. But we see described here that Jesus is a real boy. He has real experiences. He interacts with his family in normal ways. But he's also not a normal boy, right? We see him in the temple interacting with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It kind of makes you wonder how many of them were there 20, 25 years later that were calling for the execution of this boy that amazed and marveled them at some point. But here you have this 12-year-old that is doing laps around the teachers of the law. No one can quite believe what they're seeing. This is more than just a child prodigy that you see on America's Got Talent. The Greek word here, it's existemi. It's a combination, two Greek words. The lexicon describes it as meaning this: to cause to be in a state in which things seem to make little or no sense. When it says they were amazed at his understanding and the answers that he provided and the questions that he asked, they looked at this 12-year-old boy and he fit no category that they could make their brains make sense with. The literal wording means that histemi is to put in place, and the ek that's put along with it essentially says it's to put out of place is the literal meaning. There's no category for Jesus. Well, there was no category for Jesus because he's unique. He's the only begotten Son of God, full of grace and truth from the Father. He shows us the Father's glory. He's unique because he is the only begotten, which means he is entirely divine and shares the attributes and the nature of God the Father. He's totally unique because he's a real boy, and he's also those things. And they have no idea what to think of him, what to make of him, how to even necessarily respond to him. One of the saddest experiences in the triumphal entry, and I realize I'm skipping ahead a bit here. I'm not preaching on that passage yet. But one of the saddest parts of the triumphal entry is that Jesus comes into all of this fanfare, and then he goes into the temple, and he goes home. He looks around, and then he walks out of the city, and he sets up a tent on the Mount of Olives and camps there. The king of Israel, the king of the universe, walks into the temple, the place where God dwells, and then he just goes home. There's this lack of recognition, and you see something really similar here. And Jesus is really direct with his parents that he's not just a human boy. Where do we see that? Oh, verse 48, Mary says, "Son, how come you've treated us this badly? Don't you have any idea what we've been through? Have you not seen Law and Order? Criminal Minds? You know what happens to kids who disappear? 48 hours, they're gone. And just remember, we see Jesus found after 72. Statistically, they shouldn't actually find him. Mary says, look, your father and I, I think it's an interesting Greek study here, right? She addresses him in verse 48, son, why have you treated us so? The Greek word isn't son. The Greek word for son, you could translate the Greek word that's there as son, but the Greek word that's usually used for son is huios. Here she uses tekna, which is the word for child. I think there's part of Mary that's saying, look, you may think just because you're a year outside of your bar mitzvah and we consider you a grown-up at that point, you may think you can just do whatever you want, but you're still a child. And she says, your father and I have been in great... Did you think at all about your father and I and the distress that we would go through? And Jesus says, I don't think you're looking at this right. You don't know who I am. You know my name and you know my tendencies and that we grew up together. You know those things, but you should have known that I would be where my Father is. Not the one you say is my Father, but the one that really is my Father. Joseph is my adopted father. But my Father is the one who lives here, whose work is here. And Jesus, in this moment of this strange interaction with his parents, where he sort of teaches them, sort of submits to them, reminds them, I'm something different than just a regular boy. I am human and I am divine at the same time. Why is it important that Jesus be that from the beginning? From the point at which he's born and walked into the temple with Simeon and Anna to this point here and to the end of his life. Why is it important that he be both? Because if he's not completely human, we don't have salvation. If he's not completely God, we don't have salvation. And Luke wants everyone who's reading this account to know that, hey, if you're hearing about this, Jesus seemed like he had a body, but he didn't really. No. He actually grew. He was at one point, he was this tall, and then he was this tall, and then he was this tall. Actually, Mary has the little tick marks against the doorpost at home. I've seen them. And for those of you who think, well, he wasn't really God. I mean, he was something. He was a child. You should have seen him when he was 12 in the temple. He was something. But God? No. Luke says he knew who his Father was from the beginning. And if you don't have a divine sacrifice, then you don't have one that's valuable enough to take care of all of the sin that we have all committed against an infinite being, because that offense against that infinite being requires infinite punishment, unless there is one of infinite value to take our place. But you know what? He can't take our place if he's not a human being. That's the problem with bulls and goats. They're just sort of pictures of some sacrifice that will eventually come along. But Jesus is our perfect representative who can stand in our place and extinguish the wrath of God. But if we don't have both of those, then we don't have salvation. And Luke wants it. He feels it's important enough to put it on paper right here in between these two accounts that we find in the other Gospels to say, no, this was true from the beginning, right when he was born. And so we're told that Jesus has his Father's work at heart. The ESV translates it in verse 49, "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" The King James translates it, "Didn't you know that I must be about my Father's business?" Both are valid translations based on the Greek. So what is that business? Why be there? Well, I think that Luke gives us a clue in the structure of the passage. Look at verse 40. You might notice that there are bookends. Verse 40, the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Verse 52, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. When you repeat yourself in the scriptures, that's because you want someone to pay attention to something. And for those 12-year-old boys that were studying for their bar mitzvah, or those 12-year-old girls that were studying for their bat mitzvahs, they would have had their ears perk up when they heard these two lines sandwiching this account, and they would have said, that reminds me of something. And they would have said, it reminds me of Samuel, the prophet Samuel in the Old Testament. Remember, Luke is actually pretty good at this when he tells an account and all, oh, you know what? I think Abraham maybe was super old, and his wife was super old, and she had a baby miraculously that God told her was going to happen. Yeah, just like Zechariah and Elizabeth. Yeah, so here we have Luke pointing back to Samuel. How do we know that? Because in verse 26 of chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, we're told, now the boy Samuel, which sounds a lot like the language that Luke uses here, now the boy Jesus. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. All right. So we have what seems to be almost a direct quotation that Luke quotes twice in the span of 12 verses. But there's more there. There's more that ties the account of Samuel to the account of Jesus here. If we remember, Elkanah and his wife Hannah would go up every year to Shiloh. That's where the tabernacle was before Jerusalem had been taken over and they built a temple. So they would go up to Shiloh and they would worship there every year. And if you recall, Hannah wasn't able to have children. And because she prayed and pleaded with God, God heard her prayer and miraculously opened her womb and gave her a child. So we have the birth of a child to someone who ordinarily, naturally wouldn't be able to have one, a miraculous birth, parents who go up to the temple regularly, year after year, and in fact, both sets of parents leave the kid at the temple. Now, Elkanah and Hannah intentionally do it. Mary and Joseph, they're not as good of parents. But we see similar accounts here. And what's interesting is over the span of Samuel's life, what we're told in the book of 1 Samuel is actually really similar to what we see in terms of the span of what's told about Jesus in the Gospels. We see the lead up to Samuel's birth, right? All of the consternation that the parents went through of not being able to have a child. Hey, now we're pregnant. Hey, there he is. And then we get this short little vignette where Samuel's 7, 8, 9 years old. He might be younger than that, actually. He's dropped off at the temple. He has this remarkable spiritual experience where God literally calls to him verbally, and he responds the right way. And then there's this gap of many, many years, and basically we see him at the very end of his life. And what is his job? It's to anoint the king. Samuel is, for Israel, the one who ushers in King David. And here we have Luke reminding us, hey, this isn't a story necessarily about a kid that gets lost in Jerusalem. This is a story about a kid who was a real boy, fully human and fully divine. And he's going to do something for which you don't have any category to put it into. He's going to existe me your brains. He's going to usher in the kingdom. He is the king. He's better than Samuel, right? Because he's actually the king, and he's bringing the kingdom. Now, those are the things that Luke is pointing to. And I would say, if I had stood up here and only said, sort of like I did in the first service because I ran out of time, but that's another story altogether. If I had only said, look, Jesus was totally human and totally divine, and he's the king of Israel. You might have said, really, we braved the snow for that? Like, I think we've covered that material, right? Luke also gives us the response to that. There are two groups of people that respond to him in this experience, this vignette that we see here. They don't do a great job. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law, they're amazed, and they rightly should be. But that's it. They have a half-hearted response to Jesus. Just like when Jesus comes in at the triumphal entry, looks around, and then walks out of the city, they don't follow him. They don't say, you know what, we should probably set this kid up with a scholarship and get him in here. And no, they're just like the seed that falls on the rocky soil. Boom, there's growth all of a sudden, but you know what? There's no root system. Like there's nothing really invested in this, and it just withers and dies. So much so that 20, 25 years later, they're actually going to crucify this kid. They're not at all like the parable that Jesus tells. Hey, there was once this man, and he sort of was like what the kingdom of heaven is. He found this treasure in a field, and he was so excited. He hid the treasure, and then he went to the real estate agency, and he bought the field. They're excited about what they see, but they don't buy any of it. They don't want any of it. They're half-hearted. Nothing about this engagement with Jesus changes anything for them. And every time we engage with Jesus, especially in this intellectual, reasoning sort of a capacity like we're doing now, we risk the same thing of walking out and taking in the message that Jesus, as fully human and fully divine, who is the King of the universe, changes everything about how I act and think and live. His parents don't actually fare much better. Fortunately, we're told, right, by Luke that Mary treasures these things up in her heart, and we know that over time they foster in her something good. But here, in the moment, Mary doesn't get it right, neither does Joseph. I would say their response is distracted. Now, the Greek word, right, they were astonished when they saw him. The Greek word, lexicon says, essentially means to cause to be filled with amazement to the point of being overwhelmed. Literally, to strike one senseless. I don't think that they're overwhelmed or amazed or astonished because they see their son in this prodigy moment. He's about to get the golden buzzer from Caiaphas, right? That's not why they're overwhelmed or overjoyed. They see their son after 3 days thinking, he's gone. We will never see him again. We have literally lost the Messiah. And to just think of how you would be when you see your child who has been missing in Chicago for 3 days. That's the feeling that they have here. And Jesus says, you don't quite see it all. You're distracted here. You're distracted by the circumstances, by the emotions, by the surface, all of the peripheral that's happening here. You see that I was lost, but you have forgotten. You're different than you were 12 years ago when Gabriel showed up and you said, my soul magnifies the Lord, delights in God my Savior. Do to me as you say, right? Be it done to me. There's something different. Life has taken over and you've gotten tired and you've forgotten that I'm changing everything. You've been distracted here. And you've missed that I'm at work. I think the most troubling thing about this account between Jesus and his parents is that they are expecting God to do what they want. And because that's their expectation, they miss God at work right in front of them. So for those of us who are here looking at this account of Jesus, this real boy, who's fully human and fully divine, and because he is that, is worthy to be the king, worthy to be our sacrifice, and worthy to be worshiped. Do not respond to him half-heartedly. Do not be distracted by the things that are swirling about you, that are vying for your attention and your heart and your emotions. Be wholehearted. Be fully engaged with the one who was fully engaged on our behalf.